They knew that is the part no one talks about. That is the part that makes this story different from every other story about the fall of the Jedi Order. They knew it was coming. Not all of them, not most of them, but some of them, scattered across decades, sitting in council chambers and meditation rooms and the cockpits of starships on the edge of the Outer Rim, felt something that the rest of the Order refused to feel. A wrongness, a darkness gathering at the edges of everything, a future pressing against the present like water behind a cracking wall. They tried to warn the Order. The Order did not listen, and then the galaxy burned. What you are about to hear is not the story of how the Jedi fell. You already know that story. This is the story of the ones who saw it happening before it happened, who screamed into the silence of an institution too proud and too comfortable to hear them. A Jedi Master who secretly built an army to save the Republic and was killed before he could tell anyone. A council member who diagnosed every symptom of the rot with devastating accuracy and then became part of it. A maverick who found the one discovery that could have changed everything and died before he could pass it on. A quiet ancient who survived a century of captivity only to watch the darkness she recognized claim everything she had given her life to protect. And a warrior who faced the most powerful Sith Lord in 1,000 years. Won, and still lost. 5 Jedi. 5 warnings. The galaxy ignored. This is their story. Take your time with it. Let it settle. Because every single one of these beings was right about what was coming. And not one of them could stop it. There is a kind of grief that has no name. It is the grief of the prophet who sees clearly, who speaks honestly, who begs to be heard, and finds only silence. It is not the grief of loss, though loss always follows. It is not the grief of failure, though failure comes eventually. It is the grief of knowing, of carrying a truth so heavy it bends the spine, watching the world arrange itself into the exact shape you always feared it would, and being powerless to stop it. Not because you lacked the strength, not because you lacked the will, but because the people around you looked at the same horizon and simply could not bring themselves to see. Within that dimming, within that slowly thickening darkness that no one in the Order had yet named or fully understood, there were individuals who felt something wrong more acutely than most, who pressed their hands against the smoke and felt the heat underneath, who could not look at the galaxy they moved through and feel the comfortable certainty that most of their colleagues seemed to feel, who lay awake, in the way that Force-sensitive beings lie awake when the Force is trying to tell them something they do not want to hear, and felt the future pressing against the present like a tide pushing through a cracked wall. These are their stories. All of them different. All of them, in the end, the same. The Jedi Order at the height of the Republic era was something extraordinary to behold, even from a distance. The great temple on Coruscant rose above the cityscape like an anchor, its 5 spires visible from across the capital's endlessly crowded skyline. Inside those walls, thousands of Force-sensitive children and young adults lived and trained and grew into the peacekeepers that the Republic had come to rely on, so completely that most citizens could not imagine a galaxy without them. Jedi were everywhere, mediating border disputes on the Outer Rim, investigating criminal syndicates in the mid-rim corridors, standing beside ambassadors in conference rooms on 100 different worlds. Their calm presence, a signal to everyone in the room that the Republic's reach extended even here, even to this negotiation, even to this conflict. They were trusted. They were respected. They were In the minds of most ordinary beings across the galaxy, the closest thing to a guarantee that the universe would not simply dissolve into chaos, but inside the institution, if you were paying close attention, you could sense it, the stiffening, the reluctance to examine certain questions too closely, the way that the Council, that body of the wisest and most experienced Jedi alive, sometimes processed dissent with a kind of practiced courtesy that was indistinguishable from dismissal. The way the doctrine, which should have been alive and responsive and constantly interrogated, had in some corners of the Order begun to calcify, become settled, become assumed, become the kind of thing that a Jedi did not argue with in public if they wished to be taken seriously. The Force was clouding. Even before most Jedi could articulate it, there was a quality to their collective perception of the galaxy that had begun to shift. Visions came less clearly. Meditation revealed less than it once had. The connection between a Jedi and the deeper currents of the Force, that intuitive sense of the shape of things, had begun to feel like looking through smoked glass. Something was interfering. Something was wrapping itself around the Order's perception and muffling it, the way dense cloud cover muffle the light of even the brightest stars. The Jedi could still see, but they could not see as far as they once could. And most of them did not yet understand why. The dark side was rising, not loudly, not with the kind of dramatic announcement that the old Sith had favored, all red lightsabers and public declarations of conquest. Quietly, patiently, in the way that something truly dangerous and truly intelligent rises when it has learned, across generations of failure, that patience is the only strategy that works. There was a presence in the galaxy that had been building toward this moment for a very long time, and it knew, with complete certainty, that the Jedi would not see it coming, because it had made sure that they would not. Within that dimming, within that slowly thickening darkness that no one in the Order had yet named or fully understood, there were individuals who felt something wrong more acutely than most, who pressed their hands against the smoke and felt the heat underneath, who could not look at the galaxy they moved through and feel the comfortable certainty that most of their colleagues seemed to feel, who lay awake. In the way that Force-sensitive beings lie awake when the Force is trying to tell them something they do not want to hear, and felt the future pressing against the present like a tide pushing through a cracked wall. These are their stories, all of them different, all of them, in the end, the same. We begin in the place where the tragedy begins. Not with a battle, not with a death, but with a vision. With a man sitting alone in his quarters somewhere in the upper levels of the Jedi Temple, eyes closed, breathing slowing, and the Force showing him something that, once seen, he could never unsee. We begin with Sifo Dyas. His name appears in exactly one conversation in the films. A brief exchange, a moment of confusion, a question that opens a door to an enormous mystery. Obi-Wan Kenobi, standing in a cloning facility on a rain-soaked ocean world called Kamino, looking at rows upon rows of identical soldiers growing in translucent tanks, listening to a Kaminoan cloner explain with serene professionalism that a Jedi Master named Sifo Dyas had commissioned this army approximately a decade earlier. And Obi-Wan says, with genuine bewilderment, that the Jedi Council has never heard of any such order. That moment passes quickly in the film. The plot moves forward. the war begins. The clones fight alongside the Jedi, and the question of who Sifo-Dyas was, and what he knew, and why he did what he did, gets swept away under the current of a galaxy suddenly at war with itself. But the answer to that question is one of the most devastating stories in the entire history of the Jedi Order. Because Sifo-Dyas was not a rogue. He was not acting out of selfishness or ego or ambition. He was acting out of terror. Specific, detailed, prophetic terror. He had seen the war coming. He had felt it in the Force long before anyone else was willing to acknowledge that such a thing could be possible. He had begged the Council to listen, and when they would not, he had done the only thing he could think of to protect the people he loved, and it killed him. And the army he built, the secret army that he commissioned with a desperate and entirely sincere desire to save lives, that army became the instrument of the Jedi's destruction. This is the story of Sifo-Dyas, of how a man with genuine foresight, genuine courage, and genuine love for the galaxy became the unwitting architect of the very catastrophe he had dedicated his life to preventing. He was born into the Force, the way all Jedi are. Identified young, brought to Coruscant, handed over to the Order before he was old enough to truly understand what that meant. He grew up within the temple walls the way so many younglings did, surrounded by others like him, trained in the disciplines of the Force and the lightsaber and the philosophy of the Jedi way. In most respects, his early years were unremarkable. He was bright, he was sensitive, he was diligent in his studies and earnest in his commitment to the path laid before him. But there was something about Sifo-Dyas that set him apart from the very beginning. Something that the masters who observed him noticed and noted and felt uncertain about in the way that experienced Jedi feel uncertain about things they do not yet have language for. He had a gift, a particular and intense gift for seeing, not seeing in the ordinary sense, not the passive awareness of the living force that most Jedi develop with training, the ability to feel the emotions of others, to sense danger before it arrives, to perceive the subtle currents of intention in the beings around them. Sifo-Dyas had all of that, but he had something more, something raw and less predictable, and considerably harder to contain. He had visions. They came to him in sleep and in meditation, and sometimes without warning, in the middle of perfectly ordinary moments. Flashes of what was coming, images of events that had not yet happened, arranged with a strange and terrible clarity that left him shaken and quiet and unable to fully explain what he had experienced to anyone who had not felt it themselves. The Force was speaking to him directly, in a language that bypassed reason and went straight to the gut. He did not always understand everything he saw, but he always felt the weight of it, the urgency of it, the sense that what he was being shown mattered in ways that extended far beyond his individual life or his individual concerns. The Jedi Order had a complicated relationship with prophecy. It always had. On one hand, the Order acknowledged the existence of Force visions, the ability of some sensitive individuals to perceive glimpses of potential futures through their connection to the living Force was documented and accepted. There were holocrons dedicated to the subject. There were prophecies embedded in the Order's own foundational texts. The prophecy of the Chosen One, who would bring balance to the Force, was one of the Order's oldest and most debated traditions, discussed and reinterpreted by generations of scholars and masters. On the other hand, the Order was deeply cautious about those who claimed to see the future, because the future, as any master would tell you, was always in motion. What appeared in a vision was not necessarily what would come to pass. It was a possibility, a probability, a shadow of a potential outcome, not a guarantee. And those who placed too much faith in their visions risked acting on information that was incomplete or misread or simply wrong. They risked making decisions based on fear rather than wisdom. They risked letting their visions shape their perception of the present in ways that closed them off to other possibilities. They risked, in the most serious cases, becoming so certain of what they had seen that they began to work toward it, and in working toward it, to bring it about. So the Order was cautious, and that caution was, in many ways, reasonable and well-grounded. The history of Force prophecy was full of examples of individuals who had misread what they had been shown and acted on those misreadings in ways that caused harm. The Council was right to apply careful scrutiny to claims of prophetic vision, right to demand corroboration and humility, and a willingness to sit with uncertainty rather than leaping to action. In the case of Sifo-Dyas, that caution would prove to be catastrophic. As he grew older, as he moved from youngling to Padawan and eventually to the rank of Jedi Knight and then Master, his visions did not diminish. If anything, they intensified, and they were becoming focused in a way that was impossible to dismiss as atmospheric or metaphorical. Where his early visions had been scattered and impressionistic and difficult to pass, his later ones had a specificity that disturbed him in the quiet of his private meditations. He was not seeing abstract symbols or ancient mythological landscapes. He was seeing events, real events, with real scale, in real places he could sometimes identify. He was seeing war, not the small conflicts that the Jedi were routinely dispatched to mediate, not the border disputes and resource wars and political crises that were the ordinary business of a Jedi's working life. He was seeing something larger, something galaxy-wide, something involving the Jedi themselves, at the center of a war of a scale that the Order had not experienced in 1,000 years. He was seeing armies. He was seeing Jedi leading soldiers into battle across dozens of worlds simultaneously. He was seeing the Order transformed from peacekeepers into generals, pressed into a military role that they were neither designed nor psychologically prepared for, serving a republic locked in a war it had never anticipated and did not know how to fight. He brought these visions to the Council. This is the part that matters most, and the part that is easiest to rush past in the telling. He did not act alone from the beginning. He did not bypass the Council because he was arrogant, or because he had contempt for the institution, or because he trusted his own judgment above all others. He went to them first. He sat before the most experienced and powerful Jedi in the galaxy, and he told them what he had seen. He was specific. He was honest. He was as clear as a man trying to describe something the Force had shown him could be, which is to say that some of what he communicated was vivid, and some of it was fragmented, and some of it resisted articulation entirely, but the core of it was unmistakable. War was coming. A great war, unlike anything the Republic had seen in centuries. And the Jedi were going to be at its center. The Council listened. The Council deliberated. And the Council decided, with the gravity and care they brought to all difficult decisions, that Sifo-Dyas was allowing his visions to carry him beyond what the available evidence could support. They did not dismiss him cruelly. They were not unkind. They were not contemptuous of him as a person or as a Jedi. But they were unconvinced. The Republic was at peace. The Senate was functioning, however imperfectly. There was no visible threat on the scale that Sifo-Dyas was describing. His visions, however sincere, were not sufficient justification for altering policy or taking the kinds of preemptive actions he seemed to be implying were necessary. And so they asked him, gently but with the weight of institutional authority behind the gentleness, to be patient, to meditate further on what he had seen, to consider the possibility that he was misreading the Force, that the intensity of his visions was distorting rather than clarifying his perception of the future, to trust in the collective wisdom of the Order rather than in the certainty of his own private experience. He tried. He genuinely tried. He returned to his meditations with renewed commitment. He revisited the disciplines he had been trained in since childhood. He looked at the Republic around him and tried to see what the Council saw, which was stability and continuity, an institution that had endured for thousands of years and would endure for thousands more. He tried to believe that the darkness he felt gathering at the edges of his perception was a distortion, an artifact of an overactive sensitivity, the kind of misreading that the Masters had warned about since his earliest days in the temple. But the visions kept coming, and they kept clarifying. And with each new vision, his certainty grew. Not the arrogant certainty of a man who has decided he is right and is looking for ways to prove it. The quiet, sickening certainty of a man who cannot look away from something that no one else will look at. The kind of certainty that settles into the bones and cannot be meditated away no matter how disciplined the practitioner. He was assigned missions during this period, as Jedi Masters are. He carried out his duties with the competence and commitment that had always defined his service to the Order. He mediated disputes and investigated disturbances and did the work of a Jedi Knight across the systems of the Republic. But even in the middle of those missions, the visions followed him. Even standing in a negotiation room on some distant world, working through some local conflict that had nothing to do with anything he had foreseen, he would feel it. The tremor in the Force, the approaching wave, the war that was coming, that he could sense as surely as he could sense the floor beneath his feet, that he could not make anyone else believe in. He began to think about what he could do, what a single Jedi Master could do if the Council would not act, if the Order remained committed to its current course, if the war arrived without anyone having prepared for it in any meaningful way. And what he kept arriving at, in the long, quiet hours of his meditations, was soldiers. The Republic had no army. That was one of the great principled positions of the modern Republic. A deliberate and philosophically grounded choice rooted in the lessons of an older and considerably bloodier era. The Republic defended itself through the Jedi and through the individual defense forces of its member worlds, but there was no standing army, no unified military force that could be deployed across the galaxy on short notice. If a war of the scale Sifo-Dyas was envisioning arrived, the Republic would be completely unprepared to fight it, not in any coordinated, sustained way. The Jedi would be at the front by default. They would be the ones leading whatever resistance the Republic could muster, because they would be the only force with the training and the organizational capacity to do it. And there would not be enough of them. There could never be enough of them. The Order numbered in the thousands. A galaxy-wide war of the kind Sifo-Dyas had seen would require hundreds of thousands of soldiers at minimum, and likely millions when accounting for the scale of the conflict he had witnessed in his visions. He did not want a war. He wanted desperately to prevent one. He had not spent a career in the service of peace only to abandon that commitment because his visions showed him violence. But his visions told him something else too. They told him that prevention was not going to be possible, that whatever was coming was already too deep in motion to be stopped by warning or by preparation or by any action the Republic might take if it was simply told the truth in time. That the shape of what was coming was not a crisis that could be headed off with the right intervention. It was a catastrophe that was already happening, slowly, at the level of politics and conspiracy and dark side influence, in ways that even his visions could not fully illuminate. If the war was coming regardless, then the question was not how to prevent it, but how to survive it. How to give the Republic enough of a fighting chance that when the smoke eventually cleared, something would remain. Something of the Jedi. Something of the civilization they served. And that meant soldiers, an army. The Republic needed an army. And he, Sifo-Dyas, a single Jedi Master operating without the sanction or the knowledge of the Council, was going to find a way to provide it. The decision he made next was one he must have understood, on some level, would end his standing within the Order if it was ever discovered. He was not naive. He was not someone who deceived himself about the severity of what he was about to do. He was acting outside sanctioned authority. He was committing the Order, without the Order's knowledge or consent, to a project of enormous cost and enormous consequence. He was taking onto his own shoulders a burden that should, by all rights, have been shared with the entire Council. And he was doing it precisely because the Council had refused to share it. He chose Kamino as the location, a planet of expert cloners, isolated far beyond the edge of the outer systems, technically skilled enough to produce what he needed, and professionally discreet enough to do it, without drawing the kind of attention that would unravel everything before it was finished. The Kaminoans were known among those who knew of them at all as beings of extraordinary precision. They did not ask questions that were not their business. They produced results that met or exceeded specification. They were, for Sifo-Dyas's purposes, exactly what the situation required. He needed a genetic template, someone whose physical capability, adaptability, and resilience could serve as the baseline for an army of cloned soldiers. After what research and consideration he was able to undertake quietly, he settled on a Mandalorian bounty hunter named Jango Fett, a man of formidable reputation and documented combat effectiveness, whose particular skill set made him, by most reasonable assessments, an ideal progenitor for what Sifo-Dyas had in mind. Jango agreed to provide the template. Negotiations were conducted through appropriate channels of discretion, and the first cells were taken. The Kaminoans began. The work was going to take approximately 10 years, which was how long it took to grow and condition a fully trained clone soldier from the accelerated aging process they used. 10 years of cloning and training and refinement. 10 years of soldiers becoming soldiers, of children who were never really children, being shaped into something that the galaxy had not seen for a very long time and had not asked for and did not know was coming. 10 years of Sifo-Dyas carrying the secret alone, checking in where he could, trusting the Kaminoans to do their work, and hoping that when the army was ready, the war would not have already arrived. He had perhaps a year to carry that hope before he was killed. The circumstances of his death are, even by the standards of an era defined by darkness and manipulation and calculated betrayal, extraordinarily grim. Because Sifo-Dyas did not simply die in the line of duty. He was maneuvered into dying, used, and then discarded with efficiency and without sentiment by forces that had been watching him and watching the project he had set in motion with very different intentions than his own. Darth Sidious had known about Sifo Dyas's visions for some time. The Sith Lord who wore the face of Senator Palpatine of Naboo was at this point already deep in the execution of a plan that had been a generation in the making. He was going to destroy the Jedi Order. He was going to overthrow the Republic. He was going to reshape the galaxy in the image of Sith absolute rule. And he was going to do all of this through a war. A manufactured war. A conflict designed from the beginning to serve his purposes. To drag the Jedi into a military role that would compromise them philosophically. And then, at the moment of his choosing, to end them. The clone army fit his plans almost perfectly. Perhaps more than perfectly. Here was a Jedi Master who had, entirely without meaning to, done a significant portion of Sidious's work for him. Commissioned an army that could draw the Jedi into exactly the military conflict that Sidious needed. Trained soldiers who would serve Jedi commanders loyally, building trust and reliance over the course of a war, right up until the moment Sidious decided that trust should be turned into a weapon. But Sifo Dyas himself was a problem. A living Jedi Master who could see the future, who had already demonstrated that he was willing to act on his visions without council approval, who knew about the army and would eventually, if he lived long enough, begin asking questions about how the war he had foreseen was actually being shaped. And by whom? A Jedi with that kind of vision and that kind of willingness to act independently was a risk that could not be permitted to remain in play. Sidious arranged the solution through his new apprentice. Dooku had only recently left the Jedi Order, had only recently begun moving through the space between his old life and his new one, serving the Sith Master while the shape of his commitment solidified. He was given the task of managing the problem of Sifo Dyas. The details of what followed have never been entirely clear in the historical record, and that lack of clarity is itself part of the horror. What is known is that Sifo Dyas was sent on a diplomatic mission to the Pike Syndicate, to a moon called Obadiah in the Outer Rim, a mission that appeared legitimate on its surface, arranged through channels that would not immediately raise suspicion, targeting a Jedi Master who was already somewhat isolated within the Order by virtue of his visions and his reputation for seeing things that others dismissed. He never came back from that mission. The Pike Syndicate, acting on instructions passed through intermediaries, connected ultimately to Dooku and through Dooku to Sidious, shot down the shuttle, carrying Sifo Dyas over Obadiah. He died there, on that remote and unremarkable moon. A Jedi Master who had seen the war coming, who had tried to prepare for it in the only way left to him, who had secretly commissioned the very army that would fight in it, and who was killed before he could see any of it happen. Killed specifically because he had seen too much, because he had been right too loudly, because the darkness he had spent years warning against needed him quiet. After he was dead, his name was removed from the Jedi archives. Not loudly, not in a way that would draw attention, quietly, carefully, by someone with the access and the motive and the patience to do it properly. Another layer of the cover-up, another piece of Sidious's long game, hiding the trail of a secret army behind the erased name of the man who had built it. When Obi-Wan Kenobi eventually found his way to Kamino years later, the Kaminoans assumed he had been sent there on purpose, because why else would a Jedi come? The Order did not know, had never known. Sifo Dyas had carried his secret all the way to his death, and his death had been arranged to be as quiet and as forgotten as possible. What remains, when you look at the full shape of his story, is something almost too painful to sit with for very long. He had genuine foresight, real, accurate, documented prophetic vision. He had tried the right channels first and been turned away. He had then made a decision that was ethically complicated and institutionally unauthorized, but that was rooted entirely, without self-interest or personal ambition, in a desire to protect the beings he had dedicated his life to serving. And he had been killed for it. Killed by the very darkness he had been trying to warn against, before he could do anything more with the knowledge he had spent his life carrying. The army he built fought in the war he predicted. The Jedi led that army, exactly as he had foreseen, across a galaxy that burned for 3 years with the fire of a conflict that no one but him had truly seen coming. And when the time came, when Order 66 was transmitted and the clone soldiers turned on their Jedi commanders in a single terrible coordinated moment across hundreds of worlds simultaneously, the army that Sifo Dyas had created to save the Jedi became the instrument that came closest to destroying them entirely. He could not have known about that part. He could not have known that his army had been compromised from the beginning, that Sidious had reached into the very project he had initiated and twisted its deepest mechanisms toward a purpose that was the exact opposite of the one Sifo Dyas had intended. He could not have known about the inhibitor chips, the behavioral modification devices implanted in every clone soldier's brain during the growth process, the chips that made Order 66 not just possible but inevitable, that turned loyalty into a weapon at the exact moment it was needed. He was dead before any of that was finalized. Dead before the war had even begun. But the tragedy is complete. And it is the kind of tragedy that the Force sometimes seems to specialize in, though one resists assigning the Force responsibility for the choices of the beings who moved through it. A man who loved the Jedi, who loved the Republic, who saw clearly what was going to happen, and spent his life trying to change the outcome, who was, in the end, not just unable to prevent the catastrophe, but actively used, unwittingly and posthumously, to help bring it about. That is Sifo Dyas, not a villain, not a fool, not someone who was wrong about the fundamental things. Someone who was right, and alone in being right, and killed for the inconvenience of it. Someone whose desperate last act of love for the galaxy he served was turned against everything he had ever stood for. Remember that name. Sit with what it means, because his story is only the first in a long line of similar ones. The first voice in a gathering choir that no one listened to until it was far too late. There is a second voice now, and it is one of the most complex voices in the history of the Order, because unlike Sifo Dyas, who tried everything through proper channels before he was left with no choice, this voice had every resource of the institution available to him, had power, had influence, had a seat at the table where the decisions were actually made, and still could not make anyone hear what he was saying, or more precisely, could not find it in himself when the silence finally became unbearable, to respond to it in a way that did not destroy him in the process. There are two ways to tell the story of Count Dooku. One of them makes him a villain, a man who fell to the dark side and became an instrument of galactic war and the suffering of countless beings. That story is true, as far as it goes, but it is incomplete in ways that matter. Because before the villain there was the philosopher. Before the Sith Lord there was the Jedi Master. Before the man who served Darth Sidious, there was the man who saw exactly what Darth Sidious was doing to the galaxy, and saw it with a clarity that very few beings in the Republic possessed, and could not find a way to fight it from within an institution he had already, in his heart, given up on. Dooku's tragedy is not the tragedy of a good man corrupted by power. It is the tragedy of a man who was right about almost everything that mattered, and whose response to being right destroyed him anyway. He was born into the Jedi Order, as most Jedi are, identified young, brought to Coruscant, placed in the care of the temple. But unlike many Jedi, Dooku did not forget where he came from. He was born into House Dooku, a noble family of considerable standing on the world of Sereno, and the weight of that lineage stayed with him even within the temple walls. He was aristocratic in bearing before he was trained to be anything, precise and composed and deeply aware of how he presented himself to others. These were not characteristics the temple imposed on him. They were characteristics he arrived with, and that the temple's disciplines refined and directed rather than created from nothing. He was exceptionally talented. This is worth stating plainly and without qualification, because the record on Dooku is sometimes filtered through the lens of what he later became in ways that distort what he was during the long decades of his service to the Order. He was, by any honest measure, one of the finest Jedi of his entire generation. His mastery of the lightsaber was extraordinary by any standard. He eventually developed and ultimately perfected his own approach to Makashi, the second of the classical forms, the oldest of the formalized lightsaber traditions, built around precise footwork and precise blade work, around economy of motion and the kind of quiet, absolute confidence that belongs to someone who has never needed to be flashy because he has never had cause to be afraid. He could read an opponent in the first exchange and adjust in the second, and be 3 moves ahead of the conversation by the third. He was, in single combat, very close to without peer among the living Jedi of his era. But his mind was what defined him most completely. He was a thinker, in the deepest and most serious sense of that word. Philosophical, analytical, patient, in the way that real intellectual work requires patience, not as a performance, but as a genuine orientation toward understanding. He read deeply in the Order's archives and extensively beyond them. He questioned things that other Jedi accepted as settled. He pushed back, in the measured and precise and carefully worded way that someone of his temperament pushes back, against doctrines and assumptions that seem to him to rest on insufficient foundations. He was not rebellious in the aggressive or emotional sense. He was skeptical in the principled and reasoned sense. He wanted to understand why things were true, not merely that they were held to be true by the institution that had shaped him. His Padawan was Qui-Gon Jinn. The relationship between these two Jedi is one of the most important and most layered in the history of the Order, and it deserves to be understood in its full texture, because it shaped both of them in ways that neither fully anticipated and that had consequences reaching far beyond either of their individual lives. Dooku took Qui-Gon as his apprentice when Qui-Gon was 12 years old. The standard age for such a pairing, and from the beginning there was a quality to their dynamic that set it apart from the more conventional master-Padawan relationships within the temple. Dooku was exacting in his expectations. He had high standards, and he made those standards visible without apology. He was not warm in the way that some masters are warm, offering easy reassurance and comfortable encouragement, and a generosity of praise that smooths the path for the student at the cost of preparing them for the harder path that lies beyond training. Dooku challenged Qui-Gon constantly, demanded precision, demanded intellectual rigor, demanded the kind of honest self-assessment that is genuinely difficult to maintain under the pressure of a demanding master's daily scrutiny. And yet there was a deep and genuine regard beneath that demanding exterior. A regard that expressed itself in the seriousness with which Dooku took his apprentice's development. He saw something in Qui-Gon that he valued above almost any other quality. An authenticity, a willingness to trust his own perception of the Force, even when that perception did not align neatly with institutional doctrine. Qui-Gon, throughout his training and throughout the long distinguished career that followed it, would become known throughout the Order for exactly this quality, for following the living Force rather than the letter of the Council's instructions, for trusting his instincts over policy, for treating the Jedi Code as a living thing to be genuinely engaged with rather than a set of rules to be mechanically applied. Dooku had, in some ways, encouraged this, had modeled it in his own more contained and philosophical way, had shown his apprentice through years of shared missions and shared conversation that the most important thing a Jedi could do was think clearly and honestly, even when honesty required courage, even when clarity led somewhere uncomfortable. The irony of this runs deep. The quality that Dooku most valued in Qui-Gon and most deliberately cultivated in him was one of the qualities that eventually separated them, because Qui-Gon's independence of thought led him toward a deeper and more personal engagement with the living Force, with the immediate, intimate, present moment reality of the galaxy around him. And Dooku's independence of thought led him, step by careful step, toward conclusions about the Republic and the Jedi Order that were dark enough and radical enough that even Qui-Gon, who shared his master's willingness to challenge convention, could not follow him there. Dooku was elevated to the rank of master. He took a seat on the Jedi Council, the governing body of the Order, the table at which the most experienced and most senior Jedi made the decisions that shaped the institution's role in the galaxy. He sat at that table for years, long enough to see the full shape of how decisions were actually made there, long enough to develop specific and deeply felt grievances about what he observed, long enough to understand, with the kind of certainty that only comes from extended first-hand observation, that the institution he served had problems that it was not going to solve on its own. What he observed was, at its core, an institution that had become comfortable, not corrupt in the obvious sense, not operating for the personal benefit of its members at the expense of its mission, but comfortable, settled into patterns of thought and action that had worked reasonably well for a very long time, and that no one was particularly eager to examine too closely. The Council made decisions by consensus, which in practice often meant decisions shaped by institutional inertia. Things that had always been done a certain way continued to be done that way. Not because anyone had thought carefully about whether that way was still the best approach, but because change required energy and commitment and a willingness to be uncomfortable. And a body as large and as established as the Council found those things difficult to sustain consistently. Dooku found this pattern infuriating in the particular way that an intelligent person finds institutional inertia infuriating, which is quietly and persistently, and with a gradually accumulating impatience, that is all the more dangerous for being suppressed. He found other things infuriating too. He watched the Jedi serve as peacekeepers and enforcers for a republic that was, in his assessment, and by his direct observation, becoming increasingly corrupted. The Senate, which in theory represented the democratic will of 1 million-member worlds, had in practice become a body captured by the interests of those with sufficient resources to purchase influence on a galactic scale. The Trade Federation, the banking clan, the commerce guilds, the various syndicates and corporate entities that had grown wealthy enough to treat political influence as a line item in their operational budgets. These were not abstract concerns to Dooku. He watched them shape legislation. He watched them obstruct justice. He watched them do things that caused real suffering to real beings across the galaxy. And he watched the Jedi serve, without sufficient protest or resistance, a political structure that enabled them. The Jedi were supposed to be the guardians of peace and justice, not the guardians of existing power arrangements, not the servants of a Senate that had been compromised, not the peacekeepers of a peace that was itself deeply unjust to those without the resources to participate in the system on equal terms. Dooku raised this concern. He raised it in the council chambers, in the careful and well-reasoned way that he brought all concerns, with evidence and logic and the kind of patient intellectual force that should, in theory, be difficult to dismiss out of hand. In most cases, he was not dismissed out of hand. He was listened to with the serious and respectful attention that the council brought to all concerns raised by one of its members. And then, in most cases, nothing changed, because nothing changing was the path of least resistance, because the concerns, however legitimate, implied actions that the council was not prepared to take, implied a more confrontational stance toward the Senate than the Order had maintained in living memory, implied a willingness to disrupt the relationship between the Jedi and the Republic's political institutions that had defined the Order's role for generations. The Council would acknowledge his concerns and continue as before. He would raise new evidence, and the Council would acknowledge it and continue as before. This cycle repeated enough times to become something more than frustrating. It became, for Dooku, evidence of a deeper failure. Not a failure of intelligence or of goodwill, but a failure of institutional courage. A failure to act on what was plainly visible because the action that the situation required was too disruptive, too uncertain, too costly in ways that the Council was not prepared to pay. He was also, during this long period, watching the Senate with something approaching clinical intensity, watching it with the specific attention of a being who had decided that understanding how power actually worked was more important than maintaining comfortable assumptions about how it was supposed to work. And what he saw in the Senate disturbed him in ways that went beyond the ordinary frustration of a Jedi watching political dysfunction. He saw coordination where there should have been chaos. He saw patterns in the dysfunction, shapes in the corruption, that suggested something more deliberate than the ordinary decay of a large institution left to entropy. The Senate was not simply failing on its own. It was being guided to fail in specific and useful ways. The committees that should have provided oversight were being neutralized. The procedures designed to protect against the concentration of power were being exploited by someone who understood them well enough to use them as tools rather than constraints. There was a hand in this, not visible, not identifiable from what Dooku could observe from his position within the Order, but present, intelligent, patient. He did not yet have a name for what he was seeing. He did not yet know about Darth Sidious. He did not understand that the orchestrating presence behind the Senate's managed decline was a Sith Lord who had been planning this moment for decades, who was at that very moment sitting in one of the Senate's most prominent seats, accelerating the decay that would eventually justify his seizure of emergency powers. But he knew, with the certainty of a careful observer who has learned to trust the patterns he perceives, that something was deliberately wrong, that the wrongness was intentional and directed and connected to something far larger than any individual political failure, and he knew the Jedi were not going to stop it. He left the Order. This is the moment that his story turns, the hinge on which everything that followed swings, and it deserves to be paused over rather than rushed past, because Dooku was not a young man when he left. He was not someone who had become disillusioned early and departed before he had accumulated too much to lose. He was a senior master, a council member, one of the most respected and most accomplished Jedi of his entire era. He had given decades to the Order. He had trained Padawans and completed missions, and served the institution with genuine commitment through the full and distinguished arc of a career that most Jedi would have envied. And he walked away. He walked away because he had concluded, after long years of attempting to work within the system he was part of, that the system could not reform itself, that the Council would not act in ways commensurate with the situation, that the Republic was too compromised and the Jedi too committed to their relationship with it, to be moved by argument or by evidence or by any force available to a master working within the institutional constraints he had inherited. He walked away because he believed, with a certainty that he had earned through years of careful and painful observation, that something had to change, and that nothing within the Order he knew was going to change it. What happened next is what separates Dooku's story from Sifo Dyas's. Sifo Dyas, also working outside the Order's sanction, had acted in a desperate bid to protect the Jedi and the Republic from the war he had foreseen. His unauthorized action was rooted in love. However complicated its origins, and however devastatingly compromised its outcome, Dooku's departure was rooted in something darker. Not hatred, not yet, not quite, but contempt. A contempt for the institution's limitations that was already beginning to slide. In the long months after he walked through the temple doors for the last time, toward a contempt for the beings who constituted it. Sidious found him, or, more precisely, arranged to be found by him, in the way that a predator of sufficient patience and intelligence arranges to be found by the prey it has been tracking for some time. And Sidious was, in every sense that mattered for this encounter, exactly the kind of presence that someone in Dooku's precise state of mind was most vulnerable to. Because Sidious understood, with the cold and perfect clarity of a being who had spent his entire existence studying the manipulation of others, what Dooku needed. Dooku needed to be told he was right, needed someone to confirm that everything he had seen and concluded and argued for and been turned away from was correct, needed a partner who shared his assessment of the Republic's decay and the Jedi's failure to address it, needed to feel, after years of being the voice crying in the wilderness of a council chamber, that someone else was standing in that wilderness with him. And Sidious gave him all of that, confirmed that yes, the Senate was corrupt. Yes, the Jedi had failed in their fundamental mission. Yes, the system was being deliberately undermined. Yes, Dooku had been right all along, and the Order's refusal to listen had been not just frustrating but catastrophic. Yes, radical change was necessary. Yes, Dooku had always been ahead of the institution he served, and that institution had failed to deserve him. He was right. That is the piece of this that makes the tragedy complete and almost unbearable. He was right about the corruption of the Senate. He was right about the Jedi's complacency. He was right that the system was being deliberately undermined. He was right that the Order was failing to protect the people it was supposed to protect in ways that were specific and documentable and serious. He was right about almost everything of substance that he had spent years arguing for in front of a council that acknowledged his concerns and changed nothing. And Sidious, who was himself the source of the corruption Dooku had correctly identified, used Dooku's rightness as the instrument of his seduction, as the key that opened the door. Here, Dooku, look at how broken this system is. Look at how clearly you have always seen what others refuse to see. Look at how consistently you were ahead of the institution you gave everything to. Now, step forward into the role that has always been waiting for you. Help me tear this down so that something better can be built in its place. Dooku stepped forward. He became Darth Tyrannus. He became the public face of the separatist movement, the man who gave intellectual legitimacy and organizational coherence to a coalition of systems and leaders and corporate powers that had genuine grievances against the Republic. He used his real charisma and his real intellectual standing and his real gift for inspiring the confidence of beings who listened to him to convince worlds and individuals that the Republic was not worth preserving, that separation was the only honest response to a fundamentally dishonest system. And in that, too, he was not entirely or simply wrong. Many of the worlds that joined the Confederacy of Independent Systems had legitimate grievances. Many of them had been exploited and dismissed by a republic that served the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. Dooku's critique of the system resonated in places where the system had genuinely failed, because the system had genuinely failed in exactly the ways he was describing. The Outer Rim worlds that had been treated as resource pools and labor markets rather than communities of beings with rights and dignity recognized in Dooku's words something true about their experience. But Dooku had placed himself in the service of a man who did not care about any of that. Sidious did not want to fix the Republic, did not want a more just galaxy, did not want to redress the legitimate grievances that had fueled the separatist movement or protect the systems that had joined it out of genuine desperation. Sidious wanted to rule, wanted to unmake everything that had existed before him and replace it with the absolute and permanent dominance of a single Sith will over all sentient life. The separatist movement, with all its genuine suffering and all its legitimate frustrations, was in Sidious's hands. Nothing more than a mechanism for generating the war he needed to accumulate sufficient emergency power to make himself emperor. Dooku knew this. He had to have known it. He was not a man who missed things. He was not capable of the kind of comfortable self-deception that allows ordinary beings to serve causes they know are corrupt while telling themselves something more comfortable. He had placed himself in the service of a Sith Lord. He had accepted the dark side training that came with that placement. He had watched Sidious operate and had understood, at some level, that his pride perhaps did not allow him to examine too directly that the cause he was serving and the man he was serving it under were not what he had hoped they would be when he first stepped forward. But by the time that understanding had fully assembled itself, he was already past the point of return. He had committed acts that put him beyond reconciliation with the Republic and the Order. He had burned his bridges back to his old life with a thoroughness that left nowhere to go but forward. And so he continued. He served. He fought the war that Sidious had manufactured, filling the role of Sith apprentice and public separatist leader and philosophical figurehead with the same professionalism he had brought to everything he had ever done. He served right up until the moment that Anakin Skywalker cut through his defenses on the observation deck of the Invisible Hand, a separatist cruiser adrift in the chaos of the Battle of Coruscant. At Sidious's quiet and unhesitating instruction, Dooku knelt on the floor, disarmed, restrained, looking up at the young Jedi who stood over him with crossed blades at his neck, and then looking at Sidious, who said simply, "Kill him," waiting perhaps in that last moment for the Sith Lord to intervene, to value him, to find some reason to let him survive. There was none. The man who had seen the corruption of the Republic clearly, who had understood the Jedi's failure honestly, who had been right about so much for so long, died as the disposable instrument of the very darkness he had spent his career trying to diagnose. Sidious had never intended for Dooku to outlive the war's usefulness, had always planned for him to be replaced at the appropriate moment by something more direct, more powerful, more fully given over to the dark side. Dooku had been a means to an end, and the end had arrived. This is the second voice. The man who saw clearly and could not find a way to use what he saw without being consumed by it. The man whose rightness became the instrument of his seduction, because the only being willing to validate that rightness was the one who had manufactured the very rot he was trying to expose. Dooku had wanted to save the galaxy, or at least had told himself he did. In the end, he helped destroy it, and he went to his death as a man who had been right about everything that mattered and had still, somehow, managed to end up on the wrong side of all of it. Let that sit for a moment. Let the weight of it settle, because there are more voices still waiting to be heard. And the next voice is the one that perhaps comes closest to the center of everything. The one that found the answer, the real answer, and could not live long enough to give it to anyone who could use it in time. Qui-Gon Jinn was not, on the surface, the kind of Jedi who seemed destined to leave behind the most important discovery in the Order's history. He was not a scholar. He did not spend his days in the archives. He did not write treatises on Force philosophy or submit formal reports to the Council on the deeper nature of the living Force. He was, by most institutional measures, a slightly inconvenient member of the Order, a senior master with a distinguished record of service and an equally distinguished record of not quite doing things the way the Council preferred them done. A man with one of the finest combat records of his generation, who had, more than once, refused a seat on the very council that his abilities and his experience would have made him an asset to. A Jedi whose relationship with authority was, at its most diplomatic, complicated. What he had, in the place of institutional deference, was something rarer and, in the end, considerably more valuable. He had complete, unmediated, unfiltered attention to the living Force, to the present moment, to the immediate, breathing, pulsing, alive quality of the Force as it moved through and around every living thing in the galaxy right now. In this moment, not in some abstracted philosophical space, but in the actual specific reality of wherever he happened to be standing. Most Jedi of his era had a more cosmic orientation, They meditated on the larger patterns, on the Force as a vast and universal energy field that connected all life across time and space. The Jedi Code, as most masters taught it, pointed toward this cosmic dimension, toward serenity in the face of change, toward surrender to a larger order that the individual Jedi was part of but did not control. Qui-Gon honored all of that. But his own connection was to the living Force, to the specific and immediate, to the creature in front of him, the being in need of help right now. The child sitting in the slave quarters of a Tatooine junk dealer who had the highest midichlorian count ever recorded. Qui-Gon was the Jedi who looked at what was directly in front of him, without immediately translating it into abstraction, who felt the living Force in real things and real moments and trusted what he felt with a completeness that sometimes confounded the colleagues and council members who had to deal with the consequences. This quality, this orientation, this refusal to let the immediate be obscured by the theoretical, was the quality that made him awkward in council chambers and difficult in diplomatic contexts, and occasionally exasperating to his own Padawans. It was also the quality that led him to discover the thing he discovered. The thing that, in the fullness of time, would prove to be the most significant gift the Jedi Order ever received. The gift that came too late to save the Order, but early enough to give it a future. He was born on Coruscant and identified early, as most Jedi of his era were, brought to the temple while still very young, developing under the careful eye of masters who noticed his particular sensitivity to the living Force from the beginning. He was not a defiant child. He was simply someone who noticed things that other younglings did not notice, who felt the Force in ways that his peers found hard to fully account for, who had, from his earliest years, a kind of groundedness in the present moment that was unusual enough in a Jedi temple to mark him as different. He was 12 when he was taken as a Padawan by the man who would shape him more profoundly than anyone else in his life. Dooku, the man we have already spent time with. The man who was, at that point in his career, still a Jedi, still brilliant, still principled, still capable of the kind of genuine and deep engagement with another person that his later path would require him to foreclose. When Dooku chose Qui-Gon, he was choosing something that mirrored and at the same time challenged his own nature. He was choosing a student who would be as independent in his thought as Dooku was, but independent in an entirely different direction, toward the particular rather than the theoretical, toward the felt rather than the reasoned, toward the living Force rather than the structures of philosophy and politics that occupied so much of Dooku's considerable intellectual attention. They were good for each other, in the complicated way that people who are similar in some fundamental way and opposite in others can be good for each other. Dooku challenged Qui-Gon to think rigorously. Qui-Gon reminded Dooku through the sheer consistency of his example that the living world was not reducible to the categories of analysis, that the Force moved through specific beings and specific moments in ways that the most elegant philosophy could not fully predict or contain. They parted, eventually, in the way that masters and Padawans must part. He accumulated the reputation that has followed his name across history: the Maverick, the dissenter, the Jedi who could have sat on the council and preferred not to, who followed the will of the living Force even when that will seemed to lead somewhere the council hadn't sanctioned. He was respected by almost everyone who knew him and agreed with by considerably fewer. And he had long since made his peace with that. But what was happening beneath all of that? Beneath the reputation and the missions and the council disagreements and the complicated pedagogical relationships was something else. Something that was developing quietly in the margins of his busy life as a Jedi Master, in the long meditations he undertook whenever the schedule allowed, in the increasingly specific attention he was paying to a dimension of the Force that most of his contemporaries had largely set aside. The dimension of consciousness, of what persisted when the body did not, of what the Force actually meant when it said that it connected all living things, and whether that connection was something that died with the physical form, or whether it was something that could, in principle, persist beyond it. The Jedi acknowledged that beings became one with the Force at death. It was standard doctrine. When a Jedi died, the individual life energy returned to the larger field. The cosmic force, the vast and ancient energy that underpinned all existence. This was not meaningless. It was, in fact, a profound and beautiful idea. The individual did not simply stop. The individual rejoined something larger, but the standard understanding also held that the individuality itself did not persist. That what became one with the Force was the energy, not the identity. That the specific consciousness, the specific perspective, the specific I that had been a particular being throughout a particular life dissolved back into the whole and ceased in any meaningful sense to be itself. Qui-Gon was not certain this was correct. He had felt things in meditation that suggested something more, glimpsed at the edges of his deepest Force awareness, something that felt like the possibility of an individual consciousness persisting beyond the dissolution of the body. Not a ghost in the popular sense, not a lingering spirit haunting the place of its death out of unfinished business or grief. Something more fundamental, more rooted in the actual nature of the Force itself. A possibility that was there in the structure of the living Force, waiting to be understood by someone who attended to it carefully enough. He had encountered other seekers along the way, traditions and schools of thought that lived at the fringes of orthodox Jedi teaching, some of them ancient and some of them recent, all of them pointing in this direction, suggesting that the relationship between individual consciousness and the Force was more complex and more interesting than the standard understanding allowed. That there were techniques, disciplines, practices that could, in the hands of someone sufficiently trained and sufficiently selfless, allow an individual to retain their consciousness after death, rather than simply dissolving into the cosmic whole. The selflessness part was crucial. This was not a path for the ego, was not a technique that could be used to cheat death in the way that Sith had always sought to cheat it, through accumulation and domination. The Force did not reward that approach. What was being offered? To someone who could approach it with complete and genuine selflessness was genuine continuity of consciousness, not the clinging to life that fear produces, but the organic continuation of awareness for beings who had fully surrendered to the will of the Force. The Force priestesses showed him this. Beings of enormous age and extraordinary connection to the deepest currents of the living Force, who had themselves achieved what they were showing Qui-Gon was possible. They had retained their consciousness through their deaths, were still here, in a form different from biological life, but undeniably continuous with it, not the echoes of what they had been, themselves. They told him he was worthy of learning the secret, that his life of service and his orientation toward the living Force had prepared him for this in ways that a more institutionally conventional Jedi might not have been prepared, that the qualities that had made him an imperfect fit for the Jedi Order as an institution were the exact qualities that allowed him to see what the institution had stopped looking for. His training began. It was not the training he knew, not the saber forms and meditation disciplines of his Jedi formation. It was something older, quieter, more demanding in ways that did not show externally. It required sitting with the question of his own death in a way that did not look away from any part of it. It required practicing, in meditation, the complete release of everything. Every attachment, every desire to be remembered, every piece of the self that the ego generates to protect its continuity, and that becomes, in the moment of death, the mechanism by which consciousness either clings and diminishes or releases and persists. He was making real progress, but the training was not complete. And then there was Naboo. There was a trade dispute that had been allowed to metastasize into a blockade. There was a queen who needed protecting. There was a desert planet and a boy in a slave's quarters with eyes older than his 9 years, and a midichlorian count that stopped Qui-Gon's breath when he read it. There was a moment on a sandy Tatooine afternoon when Qui-Gon felt the Force speak to him in the particular and immediate and undeniable way it had always spoken to him. And what it said was this: "Here, this is the one, Anakin Skywalker." Qui-Gon recognized the Chosen One, the way he recognized everything, not through analysis, not through careful triangulation of the available data against prophetic texts, through direct, full-bodied, unmediated awareness of the living Force and what it was doing in the presence of this child. It was not a guess. It was not an enthusiasm that he was projecting onto a remarkable set of circumstances. It was a perception as clear and as certain as any he had ever had. And he had been having clear and certain perceptions about the living Force for his entire adult life. The Council, when he brought them Anakin, did not share his certainty. They tested the boy and confirmed the numbers. They acknowledged the midichlorian count. They considered the matter of the apparent virgin birth, and they decided, after deliberation, that the boy should not be trained, that he was too old, that he was too filled with fear and attachment to be safely taken onto the Jedi path at 9 years old. They were not wrong about the fear. They were not wrong about the attachment. But they were wrong about the larger picture, wrong in the way that an institution that has become slightly too comfortable tends to be wrong, which is to say, correct about the specific concern and blind to the context that made the specific concern secondary to something more important. The Force had produced this child. The Force had brought him to this Jedi Master's attention at exactly this moment. The Council prioritized the protocol. Qui-Gon fought for the boy. He argued with the Council in the direct and unapologetic way that he argued with the Council about everything that he believed mattered, which was to say, without particular deference to their authority and without any sign that their displeasure was going to change his position. He told them flatly that he would train Anakin himself if they would not assign someone else to do it. That Obi-Wan was ready for the trials, that releasing him from Padawan status would free Qui-Gon to take Anakin on. He told them the boy was the chosen one. He died before the argument was fully resolved. On the floor of the power generator complex beneath the Theed Palace on Naboo, run through by a red blade, his breath coming in the shallow and increasingly infrequent way that means the end is very close. He held Obi-Wan's face in his dimming attention and made him promise. Train the boy. He is the chosen one. He will bring balance. Promise me." Obi-Wan promised. Qui-Gon's training in Force immortality was incomplete at the moment of his death. The priestesses had not finished with him. He had not yet mastered the full technique. And so what happened to him at the moment of his death was not quite what would have happened if the training had been complete. He did not simply vanish the way fully trained Force spirits vanish, leaving no body behind, because the Force has completely received them. He left a body. He could not manifest fully, could not appear visibly to the living in the direct and clear way that a finished practitioner could, but he was there, present in the Force in a way that very few beings who had died had ever been present in it. Conscious, individual, continuous. The specific Qui-Gon Jinn, who had been the Maverick Master, the teacher of Obi-Wan Kenobi, the discoverer of Anakin Skywalker, the student of the Force priestesses, the voice who had seen so much of what the Order needed to see, was still there, incomplete in his capacity to act in the living world, but still himself, still aware, still capable of reaching, however imperfectly, across the boundary that ordinarily separated the dead from the living. He reached over the years that followed, to anyone who might be able to receive what he had found. He tried to reach Anakin. When Anakin stood in the ruins of a Tusken camp with blood on his hands and darkness flooding through him, Qui-Gon's voice called out to him across the distance between life and death. Anakin heard it. He heard it and could not accept what he was hearing, could not let it in, because letting it in would have required him to look at what he had just done. And Anakin, in that moment, could not look. He told himself later that he had imagined it, because imagination was a gentler story than the alternative. He reached Yoda. This took time, took years, took until the waning days of the Clone Wars, when the darkness had already reached the point of no return, and Yoda was beginning to understand that the path of the Order he had spent his life within was not the only path available. Qui-Gon guided the ancient master first to Dagobah, and then, step by careful step, through the training that he himself had begun and not completed. He passed along what he had learned, everything the priestesses had shown him, everything his own long years of attention to the living Force had prepared him to understand and to teach. He gave to Yoda the gift that he had been given, the gift that the Order had been, without knowing it, needing someone to carry since the last time this knowledge had been living in the galaxy. He did the same for Obi-Wan. Eventually, it took longer with Obi-Wan, because Obi-Wan needed to grieve first, needed to carry his guilt about Anakin to the desert of Tatooine and sit with it for years, letting it work through him before he was open enough to receive what Qui-Gon was trying to offer. When the opening finally came, when Obi-Wan had processed enough of what he carried to turn toward the presence he had been dimly aware of all along, Qui-Gon was there, had been there the entire time, patient in the way that only the dead, when they are truly at peace, can be patient. Between the three of them, Qui-Gon, Yoda, and eventually Obi-Wan, the knowledge survived. The discovery that the Jedi Order should have made centuries earlier and had not, because it required the particular and difficult combination of Force sensitivity and institutional independence and genuine selflessness that almost no one but Qui-Gon had possessed in quite the right measure, was passed down and preserved through the darkest period in the Order's history. And it was this knowledge that eventually made Luke Skywalker possible. That gave the survivors of the fall something to offer a new generation. That meant the Order did not die with the temple on Coruscant, but continued in something that could be rebuilt. He saw the fall coming. He saw it in the darkness, gathering at the edges of the Force, even when most of his colleagues did not. He saw it in the Sith warrior on Tatooine, who had been trained by someone still alive and still hidden, which meant the master, and not just the apprentice, was out there somewhere, patient and waiting. He saw it in Anakin, whom he recognized not with dread, but with something more complex. A recognition that the chosen one would bring balance, and that bringing balance might not look the way the Order hoped it would look, might require a passage through darkness that he could not specify, but could sense was there. He died before he could explain any of that to anyone who could have used the information. But he left behind the tool for surviving it, left it in the hands of those who would outlive him and outlive the Order, and carry it through the long years of empire into a galaxy that eventually, painfully, began to find its way back to the light. That is Qui-Gon Jinn. Not the Maverick, not the dissenter, not the difficult master who could not work with the Council. The keeper of the most important knowledge in the Order's history, who found it precisely because he was looking in a direction that no one else thought to look, and who preserved it precisely because his independence of thought had always led him somewhere the institution he served had not been willing to go. Let him rest now. He has more than earned it. There is a fourth voice. It is the quietest voice in this telling, the most private, the one that never made speeches or wrote arguments or engaged in the kind of institutional confrontation that might have left more tracks in the historical record. This voice simply looked, simply knew, simply endured, and then did the only thing left to do when knowing and enduring are no longer sufficient. Her name was Yaddle. She was a member of the same species as Yoda, which tells us very little about her, because her species is one of the most guarded mysteries in the galaxy's recorded history. Small, very long-lived, extraordinarily sensitive to the Force, in a way that suggested the species itself had some unusual relationship with the living Force that the broader galaxy had never fully understood or documented. She was ancient by the time she sat on the Jedi High Council during the final decades of the Republic, though what ancient meant in the context of a species whose members regularly lived for centuries was itself uncertain. She looked like Yoda in the broad strokes, which meant she looked like nothing else in the known galaxy. A tiny being with large eyes and a face that had absorbed enough experience to wear its weight quietly, without drama, without demonstration. She had a particular reputation within the Order. Not for combat, though she was capable. Not for politics, though she understood them. But for her deep understanding of the Force, and specifically for her mastery of an ancient Force technique called Moricro. This was a rare and carefully controlled ability. The capacity to slow the bodily functions of another living being through Force connection, dramatically reduce their heart rate and their breathing and their metabolic processes, push them toward the edge of physical function and hold them there. It was a technique that required extraordinary precision and complete control, because the difference between saving someone and killing them with Moricro was very fine and depended entirely on the skill of the practitioner. It was also a technique that had been largely set aside by the Order at large because of how easily it could be misused. The fact that Yaddle had mastered it said something about both her capacity and her discipline. She had spent decades in captivity before the events of the prequel era. A significant portion of her life had been lived not in the temple or in the field, but imprisoned on an outer rim world, taken by a local warlord who had used her as leverage and eventually as an instrument of his own purposes. She was kept there for over a century, a Jedi Master who had served the Order with distinction, held for 100 years, in circumstances that would have broken most beings of any species. When she was eventually freed, when the circumstances of her captivity ended and she was able to return to the wider galaxy, she did not appear broken. She appeared exactly as she had always been, or at least that was what the historical record suggested, which is to say, quiet, perceptive, deeply centered in the Force, and carrying within her an understanding of suffering and of the limits of individual will against overwhelming external force that no amount of temple training could have given her. The 100 years of captivity had taught her something, not bitterness, not despair, something more useful and more difficult. The understanding that endurance itself is a form of wisdom. That to exist through something, to persist in the living force through circumstances that seem designed to extinguish awareness itself, is not simply a matter of stubbornness or will, but requires a quality of connection to the Force that goes deeper than anything that can be practiced in a controlled environment. She had learned, in the worst possible school, what it meant to be patient in the Force, in the most absolute sense of that phrase. She returned to the council. She sat in the circular chamber above Coruscant and participated in the deliberations of the Order's governance through the long, slow years of what was supposed to be peace. She was present for the debates about Anakin Skywalker, present when Sifo Dyas had brought his visions and been heard with careful respect, and then sent away unchanged. Present for the gradual darkening of the Force that her colleagues were also noting but not quite naming. She was present for all of it, attending with the particular quality of attention that a century of captivity either destroys entirely or hones to something very sharp. And she said relatively little in the public record compared to what she must have been perceiving. What Yaddle perceived was what her long life and her long captivity and her particular and intimate relationship with the Force had prepared her to perceive. She felt the darkness, not as an abstraction, not as a theoretical concern about the general health of the Order's connection to the living Force. She felt it the way a being who has spent 100 years in darkness feels the first return of the dark after years in the light, recognizably, with a specificity that went beyond general unease into something like identification. This particular darkness, this quality of the gathering shadow she could sense at the edges of the Force, had a signature, had a shape. Was not the ordinary ambient dark side energy that pooled in various corners of a galaxy with as much conflict and suffering as this one contained. It was deliberate, directed, intelligent, patient, in a way that suggested someone who had been planning and building for a very long time. She did not announce this in the council chamber. She was not a being who announced things in the council chamber. She was a being who sat with what she knew and thought carefully about what it meant and what could or could not be done about it, and who spoke when speaking seemed likely to accomplish something, and who did not speak when speaking would only make the inevitable worse. She had learned this too in captivity. The difference between witness and noise, between the words that help and the words that are simply the ego's need to be heard. But she watched Anakin Skywalker when the boy was brought before the council, in the way that a being who has felt genuine darkness watches someone who is standing at the intersection of enormous light and enormous shadow, She felt both in him, simultaneous and inseparable. And she did not speak about this either, not in the council's formal deliberations, but she carried the awareness of it, carried the sense that this child was going to be the hinge on which something enormous swung, and that the direction of the swing was not yet determined, and that what the Order did or did not do in the time available would matter more than almost anything else for how this eventually resolved. Then there was Geonosis, the moment when the war that Sifo-Dyas had seen and commissioned an army to fight declared itself openly. The moment when the separatist movement, which had been building in the shadows, made its intentions visible in the form of a battle arena on a red desert world and tens of thousands of droid soldiers and a former Jedi Master leading the other side. The moment when the galaxy stopped pretending that the tensions of the past decade were political and acknowledged that they were military. Yaddle was there for the beginning of that, in the way that all council members were there for it. Present when the decision was made that would draw the Order into a military conflict, it was completely unprepared for, in every way that actually mattered. And she felt, in that moment, something she had been sensing building for a long time crystallize into certainty. This war was not going to save the Republic. This war was the Republic's ending, taking its time to arrive. This war was the thing that darkness uses when it has been patient long enough, and now wants to move. She left the council, not in the dramatic sense that Dooku had left the Order, not with speeches or philosophical declarations or a public break. She simply stepped down, retired her seat in the circular chamber at what seemed, from the outside, like a curious moment to do so. Just as the most significant crisis the Order had faced in a generation was revealing itself. She did not explain her reasoning to the satisfaction of the historical record. What fragments remain suggest only that she had concluded she could do more good outside the formal structure than within it, which is the kind of formulation that can mean many things. She knew the war was engineered, not by the separatists, not primarily. She felt in the Force what Dooku had eventually seen in the political patterns and what Qui-Gon had sensed at the edges of his deepest meditations. That there was an intelligence behind this, that the separatists were instruments rather than originators, that someone, somewhere, was conducting the conflict from a position that was not visible in any of the formal battle lines, shaping events from inside the very institutions that were supposed to be defending against exactly this kind of manipulation. She had no proof. She had what she had always had, the Force, and what it told her. A century of experience reading the quality of darkness and understanding its patterns. An understanding of patience and of how long a truly dangerous plan can be held before its execution, because she had been on the wrong end of exactly that kind of patient planning in her own history, and she recognized the signature of it, the way a survivor recognizes the smell of the thing that once imprisoned them. The Council would not act on what she brought them, because what she brought them was felt and not documented, was intuited and not provable. She loved the Council. She had served it faithfully through more years than most of its members had been alive. She did not despise it for what it was, but she understood that the help she could offer was not the help the institution was organized to receive. What happened next is preserved only in fragments, pieced together from accounts that came much later and from contexts where the full picture was obscured by everything else that was happening. What is known is that she was in the outer rim world of Mawan when a crisis involving a chemical weapon and a young Anakin Skywalker and his master Obi-Wan Kenobi required intervention. What is known is that she encountered there a situation in which the lives of ordinary beings were at stake, and in which the choice she made placed those lives above her own. What is known is that she deployed Morikro, the ancient and dangerous technique she had mastered over the course of her very long life, in circumstances that required it to be used in a way that she did not survive. She gave her life for the beings on that world, not in the dramatic tradition of lightsaber combat or last stand heroics. In the way that a being who has spent a century in captivity and decades on a Jedi council and a lifetime in service to the living Force gives their life, which is to say quietly, without fanfare, with the complete and practiced acceptance of someone who has thought about death for a very long time and has made her peace with it as a dimension of the Force rather than an ending of it. Whether she knew, in those final moments, the full shape of what was coming for the Order she had spent everything in service of, is not something the record tells us. Whether she felt the war's conclusion already encoded in its beginning, as her long experience suggested she had, and accepted what she could not change with the same patience she had brought to 100 years of captivity, we cannot say. What we can say is this: she sat on the council through some of the most critical years of the Republic's decline. She felt the darkness gathering with a specificity and an intimacy that her particular history had prepared her for in ways that were unavailable to most of her colleagues. She looked at the war that was beginning and understood, in the deep and private and largely unspoken way that Yaddle understood things, what it actually was and where it was going. And she walked away from the institution she loved, not because she had given up on it, but because she understood that the help she could offer was not the help the institution was organized to receive, and that there was still, in the short time she had left, meaningful work she could do in the living Force itself, in the world of specific beings with specific needs, in the place where she had always been most real. She is perhaps the most overlooked of the voices in this telling, the smallest, the most private, the least documented. But in some ways she is the most complete. She had seen the darkness from the inside, in the most literal possible sense. She had endured it. She had come out the other side carrying something that could not be trained into a being, only lived into. And she brought that understanding to the end of her life with a wholeness that very few of the beings in this story managed. Remember her. She deserves to be remembered. And now, the fifth voice, the last. The one that arrives at the end of all the others and carries within it the accumulated weight of everything that came before. Mace Windu was certain. This is the first and most important thing to understand about him. He was, perhaps more than any Jedi of his generation, a being of absolute certainty. His certainty about the dark side, his certainty about the Jedi Code and what it required, his certainty about the threats facing the Order and how those threats should be addressed. He was brilliant, ferociously capable, deeply committed, and almost constitutionally incapable of the kind of self-doubt that might have made him easier to work with, and that might also, in the end, have saved him. His certainty was not arrogance. He had done the work. He had thought hard about everything he held to be true, tested his conclusions against available evidence, against the perspectives of colleagues he respected, and he had arrived, through that genuine process, at conclusions that were solid. He was also, as it happened, correct about the things that mattered most. He was born on the world of Harun Kal, a planet of extraordinary and harsh beauty, its surface hidden beneath a toxic atmosphere with only the plateaus above the cloud line habitable. The people of Harun Kal were marked by that intensity and directness. Mace carried it with him to Coruscant when he was identified and brought to the temple in early childhood, carried the quality of that world into everything he did in the Order. He was extraordinary from the beginning. Extraordinary in the specific way that comes from having a particular and unusual relationship with the Force that was native to him rather than cultivated. He developed, over the course of his training and his early career, what became known as Vapad, the seventh lightsaber form, the most advanced and the most dangerous, named partly for a creature from his home world. But it was more than a fighting style. It was a philosophy expressed through combat, a way of engaging with the dark side that no other Jedi would or could replicate. Every other Jedi tradition treated the dark side as something to be resisted, kept at bay, defended against, through discipline and serenity. Mace did something different. He looked directly at the darkness within himself, the capacity for violence, the part of him that found the intensity of a genuine lightsaber duel alive, in a way that quieter modes of Jedi existence were not. He found that part and looked at it clearly and did not run from it. He channeled it, used the energy of the dark side he encountered in battle to sharpen his ability to serve the light. Only Mace could do this. He was the only Jedi in the Order's history who had managed to develop this approach in a way that did not ultimately destroy the practitioner. The technique had driven others mad or turned them to the darkness they were trying to work with. Mace held the line. Across decades of active service, in some of the most dangerous situations the Order faced, he held the line. His lightsaber was purple, the only purple lightsaber in the Order, the color that exists between the red of the Sith and the blue of the Jedi, between aggression and serenity. It was not chosen for theater. It was an accurate representation of the place he actually occupied in the Force. He was on the Council by the time the crisis years arrived. He and Yoda were the two poles of the Order's Council, different in almost every way except their commitment and their depth. And Mace Windu did not trust Anakin Skywalker. He never trusted him. From the first meeting, when the boy was brought before the Council and they felt the Force moving in him in ways that confirmed everything Qui-Gon had said about his potential and also confirmed everything the Council's caution was telling them about his danger, Mace had a specific and considered reservation about Anakin that never resolved. He did not dislike the boy in any personal sense. He recognized his abilities completely. He simply felt, in the Force, with the directness that Vapad had given him, that the darkness in Anakin Skywalker was not a thing that would stay still. It was something genuinely alive and connected to the dark side in a way that Anakin's extraordinary power meant would not stay small if it was ever genuinely unleashed. He felt this. He knew it. And he expressed it in council deliberations, which made him, in Anakin's perception, a persistent obstacle. The figure at the table who would not be convinced. He felt the darkness around Palpatine too. This is the piece of Mace's story that cuts the deepest. Because Mace Windu is the Jedi on the High Council who most clearly sensed that something was profoundly wrong with the Supreme Chancellor, and who said so, repeatedly, in terms that were as explicit as he could make them within the institutional constraints he operated within. He did not have proof. Not the kind of proof that would have been sufficient to take an action the Order's relationship with the Republic made nearly impossible to take. But he felt it, felt the darkness around the Chancellor in a way that his Vapad sensitivity made particularly vivid. Felt that the man who had made himself the Republic's symbol of stability and legitimate authority was connected to the dark side in some way that he could not see clearly through the thickening fog that Sidious had been cultivating across the Order's collective perception for years. He said this to Yoda. He said it carefully. because he was always careful about what he said in formal contexts. He raised it in council discussions with the measured language of someone who understood that an accusation without proof against the most powerful individual in the Republic was an action with consequences that had to be weighed alongside the intuition driving it. He was right. He was right in the way that Sifo Dyas had been right about the war, and Dooku had been right about the Senate's corruption, and Qui-Gon had been right about Anakin. Right about the most important thing. Unable to make the institution respond at the speed the situation actually required, the Council moved toward the truth of Palpatine eventually, but slowly. Too slowly. They concluded. As the Clone Wars dragged on and the Chancellor accumulated emergency power in ways that seemed to have no clear endpoint, that the situation required management, required careful positioning, required keeping Anakin in close proximity to Palpatine both to monitor what was happening and to maintain some connection to the only Force user in the galaxy who might have the power to deal with Sidious directly if it came to that. The plan was careful. The plan was reasonable given the constraints they were operating under. The plan was too late. Anakin was the one who brought Mace the information that forced the end. Palpatine had revealed himself, had told Anakin directly that he was the Sith Lord the Council had been searching for, and Anakin had come to Mace with this. In the middle of the night, on Coruscant, with the war still raging across the galaxy, and everything he had built his life on crumbling around him simultaneously. Mace processed this information with the speed and efficiency that a lifetime of high-pressure decision-making had given him, and he moved. He moved because he was certain. That was the thing about Mace. He had spent years feeling what he felt about Palpatine and being constrained from acting on it by the institutional realities of the Order's position. Now the institutional constraints had dissolved in the face of direct admission. And Mace did what he had always done when certainty and necessity aligned. He acted. He took 3 other masters with him: Kit Fisto, Ajan Kolar, Saesee Tiin, experienced and capable Jedi, all of them. They went to the Chancellor's office. And what happened there was not what any of them anticipated, because nothing Palpatine did in his endgame was what any of them anticipated. The 3 masters were gone almost before the confrontation had properly begun, dispatched with a speed and efficiency that reflected decades of patient preparation and the full unleashed power of a Sith Lord who had been hiding what he was capable of for half a century. And then it was just Mace. Alone with the thing he had known was there. And here is the part that sits at the center of everything in Mace Windu's story, the part that requires the most honest examination, because it is the part that is most easy to judge and most difficult to actually understand. He won. Mace Windu, alone, without the colleagues who had come with him, facing the most powerful Sith Lord in the galaxy's recorded history at full expression, fought him to what appeared to be a conclusion. He held his purple lightsaber at Palpatine's throat, with the Chancellor's own Force lightning reflected back into the Chancellor's face, and he made a choice. He said, "He's too dangerous to be left alive." He was right. In the purely tactical sense, in the sense that matters for the survival of the Republic and the Jedi Order and every being in the galaxy that Sidious was going to reduce to subjects of absolute Sith rule if he was permitted to continue, he was completely right. Palpatine was too dangerous to be left alive. Every piece of evidence available to Mace in that moment supported this conclusion. The speed with which the other 3 masters had been killed, the depth and the completeness of the deception that had been maintained for decades, the fact that even with Palpatine apparently at his mercy, Mace had no way to be certain that the posture of defeat he was seeing was genuine, rather than the opening move of something else entirely. He was right, and he was about to be wrong in the only way that mattered, because Anakin was in the room. Anakin, whom Mace had never trusted. Anakin, in whom the dark side had always been something alive and waiting. Anakin, who was at that specific moment standing at the exact point on the edge between light and dark that the entire arc of his life had been building toward, who needed something from Mace that Mace in his certainty and his clarity and his correctness could not give him, who needed one more reason to trust the Jedi. One more reason to believe that the order he had been part of his whole life was what it said it was, that it valued life, that it operated within the principles it taught, that it was not, when it came to the decisive moment, the same as what it fought against. And Mace said, "He's too dangerous to be left alive," and Anakin made his choice. What followed is the darkest moment in the prequel era. Anakin's lightsaber taking Mace's sword hand, the Force, lightning finding Mace's body, the window, the long fall into the Coruscant night. And in the aftermath, within minutes, Order 66 and the march on the temple and the end of the era. There are those who judge Mace for the decision he made in that room, who argue that had he chosen differently, had he chosen to find some way to preserve Palpatine's life and transfer him to Jedi custody or Republic legal process, Anakin would have stood down, would have found his way back from the edge, and the Order would have survived. There are those who argue that Mace's willingness to execute Palpatine rather than offering him the trial that the Jedi claimed was the right of every being revealed something about the Order's principles that made it easier, not harder, for Anakin to question whether the Jedi were worth saving. These arguments are not entirely wrong. They are also not as simple as they present themselves as being, because the question of what Mace could have done assumes options that the actual situation may not have contained, and it asks Mace to have known things in that moment that no one in that moment could have known. He was certain about the danger. He was correct about the danger. He was making the decision that his entire training and his entire career and his most honest assessment of the situation before him was telling him to make. He was also, in that moment, the last inheritor of all the grief in this story, of Sifo-Dyas's desperate and doomed attempt to prepare, of Dooku's rightness in service of the wrong thing, of Qui-Gon's maverick love for the living Force and the boy who was going to break everything, of Yaddle's patient endurance and quiet witnessing. All of it had been building toward this room, toward this night, toward the purple lightsaber and the white-haired man in the Sith's robes and the young man in the doorway who was carrying darkness and light in equal measure, and who needed something from the institution that the institution could not provide. Mace fell from the window, and the Order fell with him. He was the most certain of them. He was right about everything he was certain about. He died in the single most consequential failure of judgment in the Order's modern history. And the judgment he exercised was not, if you examine it honestly, clearly wrong. He was correct. He was decisive. He had earned, through a lifetime of service and sacrifice and extraordinary ability, the right to be taken seriously in exactly the kind of moment he was trying to navigate. And it was not enough. It was not enough, because the galaxy had been prepared for this by someone who had spent longer than Mace's entire lifetime arranging for it to be exactly not enough. Because the darkness that Mace could feel more clearly than any other living Jedi had been patient in ways that exceeded the patience of any institution or any individual dedicated to standing against it. Because the fall that was coming had been engineered with such thoroughness that even a being as capable and as clear-eyed and as genuinely prepared as Mace Windu could not find a way through it. That is the whole of the tragedy. That the failure was not the failure of insufficient ability, or insufficient commitment, or insufficient perception. It was the failure of a system facing a threat that had been specifically and deliberately designed to be larger than any response the system was capable of generating in time. The voices that saw it coming saw it clearly. They had real vision and real gifts and real dedication and real love for the galaxy they served. They were not deceived about the substance of what was happening. They were outpaced, outmaneuvered, removed one by one from positions where their seeing might have made a difference, by a darkness that understood them better than they understood it. Sifo Dyas was killed before his vision could fully translate into protective action. Dooku was seduced by the very darkness he had correctly diagnosed, because the darkness knew how to offer him the validation that his rightness had been denied. Qui-Gon was killed on a generator floor on Naboo before he could finish his training or fully communicate what he had found. Yaddle walked away from the institution that could not receive what she offered and gave her life in the quiet service of ordinary beings who needed her. Mace made the right call in the wrong moment with the wrong witness in the room and fell from the capital skyline into a war that was already over. None of them failed in the ordinary sense of that word. None of them were cowards or fools or beings who did not try. They tried. They gave everything they had. They saw clearly and acted as honestly as their particular circumstances allowed. They were, each of them, extraordinary. And extraordinary was not enough. But here is what extraordinary left behind. It left behind Qui-Gon's gift. The knowledge that consciousness does not end with the body. That a Jedi who has fully surrendered to the Force can remain present in it after death, can offer guidance to those willing to receive it. This knowledge traveled through Yoda to Obi-Wan and through Obi-Wan into the years of exile, tending the ember of what the Order had been through the darkest years of the Empire. It left behind Obi-Wan's grief and its eventual transformation. The man who had been Qui-Gon's apprentice and who had loved him and lost him and failed Anakin and survived everything that surviving cost him, became, in his desert years, something that none of his training had specifically prepared him for. And that turned out to be exactly what the moment needed. He became the keeper of the story, the one who lived long enough to pass what he knew to someone who could use it. It left behind Luke Skywalker, who was Qui-Gon's belief made literal, who was the child that Anakin could have been if everything had been different, who walked into the Emperor's throne room without a plan for his own survival and who walked back out again, not because the situation had been manageable, but because he refused to let go of the belief that even Darth Vader was still capable of making the choice that would matter, and it left behind the choice itself. Anakin's last choice, the one that Qui-Gon had always known was possible and that Mace had never believed in, and that Luke alone among the people who loved Anakin had refused to stop believing in. Vader lifting the Emperor gone, the father looking at the son with eyes that had not seen clearly in a very long time. The Force, after everything, brought to balance, not in the way anyone had planned, not in the way the Council would have chosen, not without enormous cost, but brought to balance. The thing the Chosen One was always supposed to do, done at last, in the last possible moment, in the way that only the Force in its full mystery and its full specificity could have arranged it. Sifo-Dyas had seen a war coming and tried to build something that could survive it. Dooku had seen the corruption of the Republic and tried to burn it down so something better could rise. Qui-Gon had seen the Chosen One in a slave boy on a desert world and trusted the living Force completely. Yaddle had endured the darkness from the inside and chosen to spend her last time where ordinary beings needed her most. Mace Windu had felt the darkness around the most powerful man in the Republic and tried, with everything he had, to end it on the night it revealed itself. All of them saw clearly. All of them cared completely. All of them were outpaced by something that had been building longer and with more patience than any of them could fully comprehend in time to stop. And the galaxy fell. And then, a generation later, in the way that the Force seems to work when you follow it long enough, through all the grief and all the darkness and all the cost that was paid by beings who did not deserve to pay it, the galaxy found its way back to something that could be called, however cautiously and however partially, the light. That is what it means to see clearly in a world that refuses to look. It means carrying the truth when the truth is not welcome. It means speaking into silence and continuing to speak. It means doing the work that your particular gifts and your particular position make it possible for you to do, even when that work is insufficient, even when the darkness is larger than the light you can generate, even when the outcome is not the one you are working toward. It means being present, aware, committed, honest, unable to stop what is coming, and unwilling to pretend that it is not. The Force is with you. It was with all of them. It was with them in the clarity they had, and the love they carried, and the work they did, and the price they paid. It is with you now, wherever you are, in whatever quiet you have found, whatever weight you are carrying tonight that feels too large for the space you have to carry it in. Whatever truth you can see that the world around you is not ready to receive, you are not alone in it. You never have been. Rest now. Let the story settle into the place where stories live when they are not being told. Let the Force carry what your mind cannot hold. The ones who saw it coming are still out there somewhere, in the living Force, in the vast and patient energy that connects all things. Qui-Gon, who found the way through. Yaddle, who endured everything and remained herself. Mace, who was certain to the end. Even Sifo-Dyas, whose love for the beings he was trying to protect was the most genuine thing in a story full of manipulation and design. They are all there, in the Force. With you, sleep well.